The philosophy of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was built on speed, precision, and overwhelming shock. German panzers rolled across Europe in 1939 and 1940, conquering nations in weeks, demonstrating a military velocity the world had never seen. This was the vision of Adolf Hitler, a war won by machines, fueled by the relentless advance of the internal combustion engine. But beneath the triumph, hidden deep within the Reich's strategic calculations, lay a fatal geographical flaw. Germany had no oil dot in the early 1930s. The raw political reality was simple. Any war Germany fought would be a war of logistics. And without secure access to foreign oil fields, like those in Romania or the Middle East, the Reich's tanks and aircraft would be stopped dead within months. Hitler did not accept this reality. He demanded a solution. He demanded a UTARKY-self-sufficiency. His solution was ingenious, complex, and ultimately catastrophic: synthetic fuel. This is the story of Operation German Oil the Secret, massive industrial project designed to feed the Blitzkrieg by turning mundane coal, of which Germany had endless reserves, into the high-octane gasoline required by the Luftwaffe and the WEHRMACHT. It was a technological miracle that allowed the panzers to roll through Poland and France. It was a scientific triumph that promised to render Germany immune to naval blockades. But the most dangerous weapon of the Third Reich was not the Tiger tank or the Messerschmitt fighter. It was the synthetic fuel that powered them, because the factories that produced this fuel were fixed targets, visible from the sky and inherently vulnerable. The project began as a symbol of scientific genius, yet it became the single point of failure, the giant catastrophe that ground Hitler's once unbeatable war machine to a final, sputtering halt. The process that allowed Germany to run a mechanized war on coal was known as the Fischer-Tropsch or Bergius process. These were not new inventions, but the Nazi regime poured billions of Reichsmarks into scaling them up to an industrial level never before conceived. The science was complex, akin to industrial alchemy. Bergius process. Powdered coal was mixed with heavy oil and catalysts, then subjected to immense heat and pressure, up to 700 atmospheres. This broke down the coal molecules and injected hydrogen to create a synthetic crude oil refinement. This synthetic crude was then refined into the high-octane fuel, aviation gasoline, or avgas, needed for the advanced engines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the massive diesel engines of the Panther tanks. By 1940, the Reich was strategically insulated. A vast network of massive, sprawling synthetic oil plants, called Hydrierwerk, hydrogenation plants, stretched across Germany. Most notably the colossal complex at Luna in central Germany. This network supplied over 90% of the Luftwaffe's fuel and a significant portion of the Wehrmacht's motor gasoline. The tanks and planes of the Blitzkrieg were not running on oil pumped from the ground. They were running on the technological arrogance of the Third Reich. The Nazi high command operated under a profound strategic delusion. Since their fuel source was internal and industrial, it could not be cut off. They believed they had solved the fundamental strategic vulnerability of a land power fighting a global war. They believed they had defeated geography itself. In the early years of the war, the synthetic fuel program was an unqualified success. It allowed Germany to fuel its invasion of the Soviet Union without worrying about distant supply lines at first. But the complexity of the process created a fatal, unavoidable flaw. The plants were fixed, massive, and highly vulnerable. A natural oil well is dispersed and difficult to destroy completely. A synthetic fuel plant, however, is a complex chain of massive, irreplaceable infrastructure, huge hydrogenation converters, miles of high-pressure piping, towering distillation columns, and dedicated rail networks to produce fuel. The process required constant, sustained operation. If one critical piece of infrastructure, say, a specific high-pressure vessel, was destroyed, the entire production chain could be halted for months. By 1944, as the Allies gained air superiority over Europe, strategic planners in the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, realized that they didn't need to defeat every German tank or plane. They only needed to kill the source of their lifeblood. The American plan became known as the Oil Campaign. The objective was not to bomb cities, but to systematically eliminate the synthetic fuel network. The primary targets were the Luna, Blitz, and Blechhammer complexes, gigantic targets visible from the air, representing 90% of Germany's combat fuel supply. This was a psychological and industrial war. The Allies knew that destroying the fuel meant more than just grounding planes. It meant crippling the entire German strategy. The Oil Campaign began in earnest in May 1944. The initial raids were devastating. On May 12, 1944, the USIAF launched a massive attack on several key synthetic plants. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. Initial halt. Production at the targeted plants dropped instantly to near zero. The Blitzkrieg ends. The sudden loss of fuel reserves meant the Wehrmacht could no longer execute mechanized counteroffensives. Tanks were restricted to defensive positions. Divisions were forced to rely on horses and foot transport. Hitler, realizing the mortal threat, poured massive resources, anti-aircraft guns, fighter reserves, and personnel into protecting the synthetic plants. For the remainder of 1944, the defense of the Hydrier work became the single most important strategic priority of the Reich. This created a vicious feedback loop that guaranteed the collapse of the Luftwaffe. The plants are hit. Bomber raids knock out fuel production. Fighters defend the plants. The remaining German fighter squadrons, the Jagdwaffe, are forced to engage the massive Allied bomber streams near the plants. Rather than protecting strategic airspace or the front lines, fighter losses. In these brutal, high-stakes engagements, the German fighters are decimated by Allied escorts, P-51 Mustangs, no pilots. No fuel. The Luftwaffe loses both its experienced pilots and its fuel supply simultaneously. By January 1945, the situation was irreversible. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, was virtually grounded. Tank crews watched in horror as their fuel rations were cut to ounces, not gallons. The massive Panther tanks, the world's most feared armor, were relegated to static pillboxes because the $45-ton machine burned through its scarce synthetic avgas at a criminal rate. The fate of Operation Nordwind, which you analyzed previously, was the final, brutal proof of the synthetic fuel catastrophe. While the geographical constraints of the Vosges Mountains immobilized the tanks, the fuel shortage provided the death blow. The Panzers stalled not because of American firepower, but because their tanks were running on fumes, reserved for a victory that never came. The ultimate humiliation came in the defense of the German homeland in the spring of S. 1945. The trains stopped. The rail network, dependent on diesel and steam powered by oil and coal, began to collapse due to lack of fuel and constant bombing. The tanks drowned, hundreds of fully operational German tanks were discovered by Allied and Soviet troops, abandoned on roadsides, or simply driven into rivers and trenches by their crews. They were not destroyed by enemy fire. They were abandoned because the crews had no fuel to move them, and they preferred to scuttle the machines rather than let the enemy capture them intact. The advanced German technology, the Tigers and Panthers, the Me-262 jets, all of it became worthless static junk. The fastest, Most sophisticated machines in the world were defeated by the simplest factor, the empty fuel gauge dot. This was the complete victory of industrial might over technological brilliance. The Allies' access to natural oil, especially from the U.S. and Venezuela, allowed them to achieve an unlimited, flexible supply line. The Germans' reliance on fixed, complex, synthetic factories guaranteed their rigid vulnerability. The story of the synthetic fuel project is the ultimate lesson in strategic vulnerability. Hitler's attempt to achieve autarky by outsmarting nature and geography created a single, high-value target that the Allies exploited with ruthless efficiency. It proves that in modern warfare, the true genius lies not in designing a better tank, but in securing the logistics chain that allows that tank to move and fight endlessly. After the war, the Allies, understanding the power of the technology, thoroughly dismantled the hydrogen work. But the scientific principle did not die. Today, the technology remains in use, notably in South Africa, to convert coal to fuel, especially in areas with limited oil access. But the key lesson remains: the moment you make your survival dependent on an immovable, complex industrial facility, you create the Achilles heel that will be targeted. The Blitzkrieg began as a triumph of mechanized speed, but it ended in the silence of hundreds of abandoned, fuel-starved tanks, a technological dream defeated by the merciless math of logistics. The secret gas that was meant to guarantee Hitler's eternal right was instead the poison that guaranteed its rapid death.